Coming up on this week's episode of Shadow Talk, we'll be discussing Scattered Lapsus Hunter's new campaign targeting Zendesk, a new phishing method using Microsoft Teams guest access to bypass security defenses, the current state of dark AI tools and how threat actors are using them, and finally, in the second half, we'll explore our latest report, which details a campaign by the Chinese APT SilverFox. Some sad news to start this week. Unfortunately, Kim has moved on from ReliaQuest and will no longer be on Shadow Talk. We wish her the best in their future endeavors. However, I, John Dilgen, will be taking over as host of Shadow Talk moving forward. Joining me this week to cover the news is Alex Capraro, who is a Threat Intelligence Analyst at ReliaQuest with over 5 years of experience in cybersecurity. He has prior experience as a cybersecurity analyst, and he specializes in incident response, malware campaign tracking, and OSINT investigations. Welcome, Alex. How are you doing today?
I'm doing awesome. Happy to be on the podcast.
Well, we're glad to have you here, and thanks for joining us. Later in the show, we'll be joined by Hayden Evans to discuss his latest report. Starting off the news, we have Scattered Lapsus Hunters in a Zendesk campaign. So the threat group known as Scattered Lapsus Hunters is now targeting Zendesk users, leveraging typo-squatted domains and impersonating URLs to deceive users. With over 40 malicious domains identified, this campaign highlights a growing trend of attackers focusing on customer support platforms as a vulnerable entry point.
Yeah, personally, in our customer base, we're seeing attackers use fake single sign-on portals, typically impersonating vendors like Okta, hosted on these fake Zendesk domains to steal user credentials. Additionally, fraudulent tickets are being submitted to legitimate Zendesk instances, attempting to infect help desk personnel with malware, such as remote access Trojans and info stealers, to gain access. These breaches can lead to network-wide compromise if credentials for these high-privileged users are handed over to threat actors.
This campaign is part of a larger, consistent strategy by threat actors to exploit widely adopted software-as-a-service platforms like Zendesk, Salesforce, and others. By targeting these platforms, attackers gain access to sensitive customer data and potentially compromise entire organizations through trusted third-party systems. As a reminder, we've seen groups like Scattered Lapsus Hunters be very successful targeting Salesforce previously.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to protecting yourself from this threat, there's a couple angles you need to take into consideration. The first step is to treat support platforms like Zendesk as critical infrastructure. Access to these platforms should be heavily tied down, and file upload capability, especially for logs, should be checked as to not include executable files or files that have been scanned and identified as potentially malicious. Additionally, access to these platforms should include strong multi-factor authentication so that if your credentials are compromised, it lowers the likelihood of them being used. Additionally, training help desk personnel to recognize these phishing attempts and to recognize when they might be getting tricked into executing a suspicious file are critical steps that organizations need to take.
Next up in the news, a critical blind spot in Microsoft Teams guest access allows users to operate under external tenant security policies instead of their home organization's protections, potentially exposing them to unsecure or malicious environments. Threat actors can exploit this gap by creating unprotected Microsoft 365 tenants with minimal security safeguards. By inviting users as guests, attackers can send phishing links or malware, bypassing standard email security checks.
Since these attacks occur outside the victim organization's security perimeter, they often go undetected as logs are not being sent to the SIM. Additionally, these quickly spun up tenants don't have the licensing to even have security safeguards, making it easier for threat actors to configure them and faster for them to spin them up. This highlights the growing risk of cross-tenant collaboration in an increasingly interconnected work environment.
So this method is particularly worrying because in 2025, Teams phishing became highly prevalent, largely driven by its widespread use among groups like Black Basta. Last month, ReliaQuest threat hunters highlighted on Shadow Talk a recent surge in Teams phishing campaigns that impersonate help desk users to target end users. There's a realistic possibility that this new tactic will be integrated into the existing campaigns, ultimately enabling attackers to bypass security controls and successfully phish users. Businesses should limit guest access to trusted domains only, implement cross-tenant access controls, disable unnecessary external Teams communication, and train employees to recognize and avoid unsolicited guest invitations. These proactive measures are essential to preventing the exploitation. And I know training employees, we harp on it a lot, but again, to reinforce, it is very effective at stopping these campaigns and was really effective in that black box to phishing method earlier this year.
Additionally, we recommend creating detections to identify when suspicious domains and tenants message your users. You can do this by looking for terms such as help desk, IT administration, or other terms that might be suspicious in your organization. As we mentioned, this tactic has the potential to enhance current phishing campaigns. I'm curious if our listeners know of any campaigns that this tactic could enhance, or if they've already seen it. Let us know via email or in the comments below.
Finally, in the news, dark LLMs or large language models aid petty criminals, but underwhelm technically. While AI generated malware hasn't revolutionized cybercrime, tools like Worm GPT-4 and Kawaii GPT are enabling novice hackers to launch more effective attacks. These tools help create phishing emails, basic malicious code, and even ransomware templates, making entry-level cybercrime more accessible and professional looking. Despite initial fears, dark LLMs haven't significantly altered the threat landscape for organizations. Their capabilities remain technically underwhelming, relying on known malware techniques rather than introducing novel or sophisticated attack methods. This means that existing cybersecurity tools can still detect and mitigate many of these threats.
Yeah, and this is something that me and Alexa spoke about in our spotlight we released earlier this year about how threat actors are using AI. We are typically seeing templated boilerplate code being copy pasted and trying to affect as many organizations as possible, trying to catch organizations that might not be as proactive in their defense against scripts that are well known. The subscription-based model and free access offered by tools like Worm GPT and Kawaii GPT lower the barrier to entry for cybercriminals. Organizations are likely already experiencing a rise in unsophisticated yet competent attacks, such as click fix or other copy-paste malware techniques. These attacks are particularly from individuals who lack technical expertise, but are now able to leverage AI tools to run these campaigns. The slow advancement of AI in creating novel cyber threats gives organizations a window to strengthen their defenses. Investing in employee training to recognize phishing attempts and maintaining robust detection systems for known malware techniques remains effective in combating these AI-enhanced attacks. We definitely suggest having EDR on all devices if possible to detect these well-known techniques such as shellcode loaders and other common malware threats.
Yeah, and this is really interesting tactic and information because in our predictions report, we predicted that the AI tools that are being used for penetration testing, things like Expo and Ridgebot, will soon become compromised to help assist these campaigns. But it's interesting to see that the tools for the broken or jailbroken ChatGPT style models are not that effective at creating new malware. For example, we've seen things like Expo actually be able to find 0-day vulnerabilities in code and begin writing exploitation code. So, kind of the differences in how the AI are developing. So, I'm curious, do our listeners think dark AI tools will evolve to create more advanced malware in the future? Let us know via email or in the comments below.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
In the second half, we're joined by Hayden Evans, who is a Threat Intelligence Analyst at ReliaQuest. He has experience in the F3 EAD lifecycle and analyzing adversaries' tactics, techniques, and procedures to operationalize the information. He has also experience with intrusion response, OSINT investigations, and offensive security. Welcome, Hayden. How are you today?
I am doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on, John.
You're welcome. Glad to hear it, and thanks for joining us. Hayden's report, which will release tomorrow, December 4th, covers a sophisticated campaign by the Chinese APT group SilverFox, which uses deceptive tactics like Russian false flags to target organizations in China. Leveraging modified ValleyRat malware, this campaign exemplifies the group's dual focus on espionage and financial crime. Starting off, Hayden, can you provide an overview of this campaign and SilverFox?
Yeah, definitely. So you first kind of hit it on it a little bit already. So SilverFox being a kind of rare dual goal orientated group that does conduct that state sponsored espionage or cybercrime for financial gain. And we'll talk a little bit more deeper into why that is for this group. But as far as this campaign itself, SilverFox has previously in the past about year and a half have been conducting these SEO poisoning attacks. And for listeners that don't know, SEO poisoning is essentially where you're using legit or illegitimate means of ranking high within search engine results, a lot of times impersonating legitimate applications. So this group previously impersonated applications such as like Telegram, and this one, they are impersonating Microsoft Teams. So if a individual is searching for the software to be able to download it, they are impersonating specifically a Chinese top level domain. So that domain being teamscn.com. And from there on that website, it looks very similar to the legitimate Microsoft Teams downloader. And a user may download the software from there, which includes malware known as ValleyRat that this group utilizes. And once that malware executes, it does a few different things that we'll talk a little bit more deeper about. But just as a high level overview with it, it creates defender exclusion paths from drives within the host to be able to exclude itself from being screened from antivirus. Checks for the use of 360 Tray, which is a popular antivirus within China. And from there, it gives the attacker essentially just full access to that system that is infected with ValleyRat malware, being able to exfiltrate data, things like that. And in this one, that was a little bit different that we've seen from previous reporting is that there was a lot of Russian false flags within it. So, for example, the zip file the individual would download had Russian characters within it. And also that the executable for ValleyRat malware, which is setup.exe, it includes another executable within it that is written to the system called verifier.exe. And this is a Trojanized version of the Microsoft 32-bit C++ library installer. And the executable itself and the user license agreement, things like that, are all entirely in Russian within it as well.
Well, very interesting. I really like this report. And a couple things that I wanted to highlight in it. You mentioned how realistic that Teams phishing page actually is, and you have a sample of that in the report. I remember looking over that and thinking how difficult it would be for an end user to actually notice that they are on a phishing page. It was very legitimate. And I thought the Russian false flags were another interesting and unique element around this. Can't wait to dive into those in a second.
Yeah, and I also really thought the false flags are really interesting, as we've seen other malware campaigns in the past abuse Cyrillic characters in domain names and file names to try to bypass static file detections and file name detections. For instance, an organization might try to detect suspicious Microsoft Teams installer executables based on the name, but because these are Cyrillic characters that look similar to their English alphabet counterparts, it might trick the user without triggering the detection.
Yeah, good call out there. Interesting element here. Next up, Hayden, if SilverFox is a Chinese linked group, why are they targeting organizations in China?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the big questions with this one that's very interesting. So I think kind of zooming out a little bit with this group and just overall the operations from China. So previously, China has had offensive operations being conducted internally, such as from the Ministry of State Security and the People's Liberation Army in like early 2000s, early 2010s. And within the early 2010s, these operations were then exposed, such as the PLA Unit 61398 being named as APT1 in a report that covers their operations, which led to indictments by the U.S. Department of Justice. And with China, of course, their main goal is gathering information to forward their economic progress. So from then, we saw a shift sort of happen. So mid 2010s, they shifted to a contractor model. So compared to Russia, which is much more internal sort of operation still, China is very deeply ingrained within the global trade system. So being named really risks their economic standing as well. So they really want to maintain that image of being a global leader with influence. And again, that could also erode trust from there. So with their contractor sort of style of their offensive operations, they could hire private companies or contractors, and what that allows them to do is to tap into a wider pool of talent. It could be a little bit more cost effective, it's scalable, and the biggest thing for them is it introduces plausible deniability for them. So essentially these attacks aren't being conducted by the country, it's being conducted by these contractors. And as far as this group targeting specifically Chinese organizations, there's several sort of theories or things going around as far as different reports that other researchers are seeing. But the biggest one that's believed to be is it allows them to self-fund their own operations without relying on, funding by the state. So they're conducting these financially driven attacks that are both domestic and foreign. And it allows them to test new tools, malwares, techniques without being traced back, to them as far as like an international threat. Again, reducing that risk of exposure and being named. And from there, it allows them to mix both domestic cybercrime with their, state-sponsored operations, being able to have more of that greater plausible deniability by just kind of having a general appearance of cybercrime.
That's really fascinating, the difference between the Russian cybercrime outlook and the China cybercrime outlook, specifically around contractor usage. I remember recently there was a cybersecurity indictment against a user in China who was very prominent in recent attacks, and they were a worker at a large cybersecurity company within China itself. So it's really fascinating. Moving on, what is the malware ValleyRat and what makes it dangerous?
Yeah, so this malware is exclusively utilized by Chinese APT groups. So it was first seen around February of 2024. It's an evolution of another malware variant known as GhostRat. And again, this was previously deployed against Chinese speaking users through, like I said earlier, SEO poisoning with other apps like Telegram. It was also deployed via phishing as well. And one thing that's kind of interesting with this malware, it's actually downloaded from Alibaba Cloud Storage, which might not trigger any flags or detections for organizations. And some few kind of key differences we saw in this sort of infection chain compared to previous reports of ValleyRat is it installs files within a fake Embarcadero path. And Embarcadero is essentially an integrated development environment or an IDE. So it's just trying to hide itself there. And then it loads its actual binary data from files that it installs on the system, such as profiler.json and GPU cache.xml. And from there, it actually executes a malicious DLL, which if you're an incident responder and you see run DLL32 actually making outbound connections to a malicious location, such as a C2 server, that's known as binary proxy execution for run DLL32. So you actually see within the SIM or within the EDR that you're looking at is straight connections from that process as well, which is a little bit strange because you're actually looking at a legitimate Windows process there. This technique's not new, but it's just an interesting one being utilized by the group. And from there with ValleyRat enables them to have again full control on that system, be able to steal financial data, sensitive data, and things like that from there.
That's a really good call out you made, specifically around the legitimate Windows process, run DLL32, making those outbound connections. And I definitely remember that being one of the early challenges that a lot of new analysts have, is that they see that legitimate process and immediately it forces them towards thinking the activity is legitimate. So absolutely great call out there. One of the questions I'm most excited for is, how do we attribute this to SilverFox?
So definitely with any sort of attribution and something that comes down to, sort of state or country level attribution, of course, we want to be like thorough and transparent as we can. So within that report, we actually have a analysis of competing hypotheses. So we actually kind of did a little bit of a mental exercise of where these attacks could actually be coming from. Could it be just a Russian based cyber criminal? Could it be again like a Russian like nation state level group? And from there, of course, going through all the evidence that listeners could see a little bit more in depth within the report itself. But for example, one of them, the use of like Alibaba cloud infrastructure, that's previously been reported on from being utilized by this group. Also, the providers that they use for their C2 servers, things like that. So it just really kind of narrowed down from the evidence to really point it from there, but also from investigating the infrastructure itself. So the Microsoft Teams background utilized on that website, we actually found many other websites that had that same sort of background, or at least that resource on that website. And those were previously utilized by SilverFox within attacks as well. So really kind of a smoking gun there pointing to them. And then, like I said earlier, the C2 server, some of the infrastructure was actually traced back to them as well, too, with previous attacks.
That's really interesting. And the use of that hypothesis of competing analysis and table is really a great feature of this report. I definitely recommend checking it out, especially because attribution is so difficult, not to mention the fact that there are false flags in this, and the table outlines the false flags against the evidence and how you maintain your conclusion very well. So I definitely recommend taking a look at that. Finally, what steps can organizations take to protect themselves from SilverFox and this campaign?
So fortunately, there is a lot of good opportunities for defenders to be able to catch this sort of attack. That being the ValleyRat malware, once it actually executes, it's actually relatively like straightforward to detect. Here at ReliaQuest, we actually detected every single one very early on. So we actually never saw what the attack was going to end up being. Was it just going to be sitting there for a while? Was it going to be stealing certain data, just financial data? So we actually never saw the actual impact in the end within our customer environment. And the reason being, it's actually still a little bit noisy with that malware. Of course, we could see that there's ongoing developments with it, with the different changes that we saw in this execution chain, but use things such as like PowerShell, and again, that run DLL32 execution. So it is a little bit noisy. So biggest sort of way that organizations can take to protect themselves from it is really just ensure you have your logging up to date for your detection. So your command line logging with like Windows Event ID 4688 and PowerShell script block logging being Event ID 4104, just making sure you have that full visibility within your network and your host, and also sort of regionally or internationally. So again, with this being sort of a regional sort of specific threat, if global organizations don't have adequate logging within certain regions, they just really want to make sure they tighten that up and have that full visibility from there, making sure EDR is deployed as well, making sure everything's set to block. And from there, to be able to stop this sort of attack in its tracks, we really want to have like application controls within the host, of course, be able to kind of constrict what's able to be executed with on it. I know that's not really the easiest thing to do for organizations as a whole. So from there, another thing we could do to kind of reduce those risks of SEO poisoning altogether is really directing your users, instead of looking for software applications themselves within the wild, wild west that is still the internet, possibly being able to put together something such as like an employee self-service application catalog, to where if they need Microsoft Teams, they could go within that self-service portal to be able to download that software.
Those are some great recommendations, especially that last one about having the approved applications that employees can access. As we've seen across many campaigns, including Oyster and BowLoader this year, fake software impersonation and employees downloading legitimate looking software that is really masquerading as malware is one of the top tactics that are spreading malware today. So absolutely great call outs there. In closing, I want to say thank you to Alex and Hayden for joining us on the podcast today and sharing your wisdom. I want to say thank you to our listeners for spending your valuable time with us. As a reminder, the links in the link tree below if you want to check out any more of these articles or reports that we mentioned. Also, check out ReliaQuest's YouTube channel, which is now featuring Shadow Talk, if that is your preferred platform. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcast platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk, your weekly cybersecurity news and threat research podcast made for practitioners by practitioners.